Thank you. Thank you so much, Tosca, for this great introduction. So what I want to talk to you today about is these different kinds of models of servant leadership, how servant leadership is perceived in the literature in general, what it means and where it has come. And crafting that actually was quite a difficult process, but luckily I had some wonderful people helping me with this, and they're here, some of them. We had volunteer students, so can you raise your hands so that everyone sees? These people were very, very important in helping me to bring all the literature together, do the analysis, and build all of that. So a big thank you goes to them. And of course to the Moynihan Institute for Transnational NGOs as well, because they invited me here and gave me the opportunity to study for 2 weeks and reflect upon the things that are very relevant to today's civil society. So today we're in kind of an odd situation. If you look at where we are, and Tosca said that I'm a conservation biologist and environmental scientist, so that's usually where I want to start with things, because I think this is where the basics of society and the environment kind of clashes. You see the ecology and you see the economy. So now you see that they are looking completely opposite direction, right? But they have something very much in common. What do you think is that they have in common? What do you see between ecology and economy to be very much in common? Yeah.
Natural resources.
Natural resources. Why natural resources?
Natural resources can be a driver of the economy. That's also the essence of an environment.
Yes?
We are utilizing ecology in a rational way for economic and profit, so that way we are harming the ecology and the population and the
Okay,
community.
but something very, very basic. Look at the two words. What do they have in common? The two words. Huh? Eco, right? And what is eco? Eco essentially is this. This is eco. Because in the Latin word, the word eco is essentially equal to oiko. So oiko means in Greek the household, our house. And the earth is our house, and I was quite surprised to see that beautiful image of the earth is here at the bottom of at the Eggers Hall. Yeah. And also then in one of my talks, Elena pointed out that there is a beautiful one right across by the geology institute. And funny enough, I have started my graduate studies in geology. So I first became a geologist. Then after that, I went to environmental science. So that came as a surprise. So oiko, ecology, is actually oikologia, which means the knowledge of the household, the knowledge of our planet. Oikonomia is the management of our house. So you would expect that the management of the house is based on the knowledge of the house, right? Is that the case right now? Definitely not. Because the economy thinks not in terms of the planet or the household at all. It exploits the household. Not only does economia do that, it even doesn't look at it as a like you were saying, as a resource, because it thinks the economy is a perpetual motion machine against the laws of physics. And that is why it's causing all this kind of destruction. Now, the most important thing here, and which is the topic of what we're going to talk today, is oikonomos. And oikonomos actually means the steward of the house. So when I talk about servant leadership, I'm really talking about stewarding the earth, which unfortunately we haven't been doing, because when you look at the situation of the earth, we see that all the life support systems of the planet are in danger, or are essentially, we are overburdening the planet and making it uninhabitable for people. And you would expect that if this is the situation, humanity would start acting on it, right? Humanity would act and save its household from being destroyed. If you have a real steward of the house, that's what you would expect to happen. Unfortunately, the situation is that we definitely have politicians who are not leaders, but we don't also have other leaders to show that kind of leadership, to be the oikonomos of the planet, to really save the planet. And how would you do that? The way you would do it is basically by showing the leadership, showing the servant leadership, to make sure that humanity stays in here. And when you look closely at this diagram, you see that gender equality, health, food, water, income, education, resilience, voice, jobs, energy, these are all social policy, social, environmental, development, NGOs, whatever you want to call them, the NGOs that work on the social side. So they have to ensure that there is a social foundation to humanity's existence on the planet in this green zone. And then if you look outside, you see climate change, land use, fresh water, biodiversity, all the other NGOs that are trying to make sure that the environment is conserved. And that can only be done by the oikonomos of those as an epistemic community in acting together to keep us in this zone. And that is why I talk about servant leadership here. That's why servant leadership is important, because through servant leadership, we can really tackle this great problem. So where did servant leadership come from, and how did we start with this? It comes from basically Robert K. Greenleaf, 1977. He's the one who used it the first time out of the context of the faith-based. If you think of that, it would be Jesus to start with. So you would go to, to Christ times. But no, we're talking about not a faith-based, but of the modern notion of servant leadership. And that really starts with this seminal book by Robert K. Greenleaf. But it was from 1977. And it was a journey into the nature of power and greatness. So, being a humble servant leader for greatness and power. That sounds kind of very interesting, doesn't it? It's kind of Oz, the great and the powerful, right? Who is the big wizard who is trying to save this world from evil through his greatness and through his power. But let's look at the conversation at the end of the film. I know you had it in you, Glinda says to Oz. When it's all over, greatness, asks Oz. Goodness, answers Glinda. In the film, the battle was won eventually by Oz working together with the people. At the end, he had to give up the stage to be the man behind the curtain. Instead of striving for greatness, he learned the value of goodness that brought friends and love. And that is eventually what helped that world to survive, that world to go into the next step. Did anyone watch of you this movie, Oz? None of you watched it? Oh, you did? Do you remember that scene when that dialogue comes? That's when it all untangled, wasn't it? I mean, when they, and of course, right after that, they kissed.
Do you know that the author of the novel used to live just outside Syracuse?
Oh,
In
there
a
you see.
village right next to mine.
That is called universal attraction. One reason I must be here. So let's look at a little bit of what really in scholarship, how is servant leadership understood. I find Spears's 1998 article quite important here because it really outlines in 10 simple ways of what servant leadership is. First of all, it's about listening. It's about really listening. It's listening to it receptively and attentively, and also not to the person that you're only listening, but at the same time to your inner voice. What is it that evokes in you what the other person says? So that means like you're not passive listening, but you are an active listener when you are a servant leader. And empathy is another one. It's of course related to active listening, but it's something more because it creates a certain acceptance and understanding of whom you're listening to. And here, when Tosca was starting the talk, it was talking about this larger constituency, so that listening and this empathy has to not be only with one person, but with a larger community at the same time. So a servant leader would need to be able to listen to a large number of people, so to say, rather than just an individual. And then healing is another one. A true servant leader is a force of transformation. So it provides healing to him or herself or to others so that a wholeness can be achieved. So as you can see, this is almost, in a way, a systems sort of look, which is also in the sense of the awareness there as well, because it includes both general and self-awareness. And a servant leader does not only understand the situation in a holistic way, but also understands, while seeing the whole, his or her own limitations in it. So it is, in that sense, a humbling experience. It comes through self-awareness as well as of an awareness of a whole in total. And then translation, that is to be a mirror and build ideas together, not with persuasion, which can be another form of violence. So it is much, a servant leader would co-create with people rather than try to convince somebody, persuade somebody into that idea. Like Michel Serres, the famous philosopher, says, every discussion is a form of violence. So Michel Serres would say, do not go into a discussion, but go into an understanding of each other. And start from there. And then build together an understanding, rather than engage in a discussion and persuasion, which is a completely different dynamic. Conceptualization. Servant leaders demonstrate broad-based systems thinking and help create the visionary concept of an institution through these participatory processes, builds these processes, and moves from there. And then builds institutional history, has kind of, through that institutional history, a foresight, and can take lessons from the past and the realities of the present and kind of project to the future in order to be able to co-create that future together with the constituency. And of course, like we talked from the very beginning, stewardship, holding the institution in trust for a greater good of society and serve the need of others. And here I put the others in brackets because we're going to look at who those others are as the presentation progresses. And the final two, servant leadership is about commitment to growth and development of people, of the constituency itself, and of every single individual. So a servant leader really the thing that it cares most about is the people and how it can grow those people, and through the growing and developing of the people, grow the organization itself. And finally, building community. So servant leadership does not only have a team, but builds a community out of the team. Because the community has shared values, supports each other, helps out, works together. It's not just a differentiation of roles, but it is really about a collective effort towards a common goal. Well, this is not exactly what Spears said. I'm afraid I made some changes because, again, I think like the greatness and the power that I erased from Greenleaf, I erased from Spears the notion of persuasion, because he was still stuck with persuasion. I said, let's go to translation and co-creation. And also, to only foresight, I added building of an institutional history, because building of an institutional history is about also building community and building memory. So an only foresight-based approach loses the identity of an organizational history and where it comes from, which is very essential to a community building organization. So here I try to define, let's say, my kind of servant leadership in a way, starting from through literature. But people have tried to position servant leadership with many different leadership styles. There is transformational leadership, authentic leadership, ethical leadership, level 5 leadership, empowering leadership, spiritual leadership, self-sacrificing leadership. Now, all of these are in literature, and all of those have their own sort of definitions and things. There are overlaps, there are differences. Jun was very kind to kind of bring them all together for me and disentangle all the differences. And what we've found out that all of these are fine. You could just like take them all, put them together, and also call servant leadership. There are nuances, there are differences, but what's important is the overall approach here. Because of course, like in other forms of leaderships, which are collaborative leadership, relational leadership, integrative leadership, contextual leadership, situational leadership, like in contextual leadership, you will have different contexts. So yes, of course you are a servant leader, but you are going to build community before taking a decision. You co-create and everything, but at once there is such a big danger that your community might fall apart. And as a leader, you just say, okay, guys, trust me, we're going. Okay, then there's no time for process. Then it is not really, to the book maybe, servant leadership, but for that trust to be built, you had to show that servant leadership so that at that critical moment, you could go together. So that specific behavior of that leader at that given time, you couldn't maybe label that perfect servant leadership model and put it into that box, but that is what it was about. So these categories, these labels are there, but let's look at the essence of what the meaning there it is. Of course, when you have so many leaderships, you have the scholarship about the servant leadership, and somebody comes up like this and talks like me, says this is about servant leadership and so forth, this is how you should act. Then any rational person, like this gentleman here, like makes the eyes like this very thin and says, with a critical mind, and that's how everyone should have, of course, that critical mind, prove it to me. How do I know that servant leadership really works? That is when reductionistic science comes into action. Give me the data, he says, and let's see if we can give you the data and convince you. Maybe those eyes can open and you can build a belief in it. Well, they did that critique. Exactly, they asked that question in the 1980s and 90s, and therefore, people started researching. First, they needed to develop the notion of what servant leadership is, like I did, and then they started doing research about it. And you can see that especially in the 2000s, many different empirical research came out which kind of tried to understand whether servant leadership really works or not. Well, for example, Hamilton 2009 found that constructive impacts of servant leadership on organizational performance in mission and value focus, creativity and innovation, responsiveness and flexibility, commitment to both internal and external service, respect for employees, employee loyalty, and celebration of diversity. So you see that this research, maybe not statistical or of any other kind, but through in-depth interviews, has come up with showing the correlation between that kind of leadership and the benefits it creates. Let's look at Joseph and Winston in 2005. They discovered a significant relationship, now here we have statistics in there, between servant leadership and leader trust. So when you have servant leadership behavior in a leader, the trust to the leader is significantly higher.
Do you mean the trust in the leader?
The trust in the leader. And between servant leadership and organizational trust. So not only, this is very interesting, not only trust with the leader increases, but also the trust with the organization increases. Because that kind of leadership induces trust to the organization, which then indicates that organizational performance, including organizational satisfaction, safety practices, productivity, financial performance, all have positive impacts coming from that kind of leadership. Now, let's look at Awan et al. This is a very recent study in 2012. They did a regression analysis actually, and they found significant positive effect of servant leadership on employee motivation. Now, forget about leadership trust. We're now back to the employee. The employee is far more motivated when you have that kind of leadership in the organization. And a significant positive effect also on work performance, which means, of course, when they're motivated, you would expect them to perform better, right? That makes sense. But they found it statistically also true. So they're not only motivated and unproductive, but they're both motivated and productive. So which is good, right? Motivation by itself doesn't pay the bills, so to say. Okay. And then an empirical study of Mekar and Bosco showed that servant leaders can cultivate their followers and lower level managers into servant leaders. Now this is very important, this research, because if you have servant leadership in the organization, you have only the top person or a few servant leaders in the organization, its benefit is not as high. What you would expect, it is essential that across the whole levels of the organization, lateral or vertical, you have the kind of servant leadership everywhere. And this study shows that you can foster it, you can have that sort of go through the organization and become a cultural and practice. So coming back now to our dear Greenleaf, who wrote the seminal paper. In a seminal paper, he says the servant leader is defined as servant first. So we talk about leadership, but this person is not motivated really by leadership. Okay? Doesn't necessarily want to be a leader. That's not the priority. The person's priority and first is to serve, is to help, is to change things. That's the major first motivation. Now, wanting to do that, then you might have to step into a leadership in order to provide that service. And that leadership even might not be obvious to the eye. Like in his book where Greenleaf talks about the character of Leo, which is kind of like a servant in a journey. And then later on they find out that he's actually the head of an order. But there he did this kind of leadership out of service, out of protecting this journeying group in a very unobtrusive or non-expressional way, through just being and guiding and leading in this servant mode. And therefore, it comes from the care of the others. So for a servant leader in a transnational NGO, what would be your constituency? I think if you would take a social enterprise or even a company, I think this would be pretty much, you could overlay that to each other. So the constituency would be, first of all, the board, because it has a governance structure. There are people who are at the end responsible for setting a policy and setting the organizational mission and vision. And then there is staff. Then there are volunteers. There are members. There are donors. There are supporters. Now this is your immediate constituency, right? These are the people which you ought to be in an organization almost dealing on a daily basis. Maybe not with the board on a daily basis, but staff and volunteer and members and donors and so forth. You would have this constant sort of going about and interaction between all of those. But then there is also a not so immediate constituency, which is the public and organizations that know about your organization, and even the ones that don't know about you. Because as an organization, as a transnational NGO, you want to provide services, you want to provide advocacy, you want to change the world into this beautiful green donut, right? So going into that beautiful green donut, there will be your responsibilities for people that do not even know about you yet, and organizations. So you do not care only about the ones you know and you touch, but you care about a larger sort of constituency. And that constituency, in the case of that green donut, can be a beautiful butterfly. It can be a panther. It can be the chemistry of the soil. So that constituency, when we're talking, is not necessarily in that sense also what we understand as things of having rights like us, right? So that constituency in its broader sense, and that service, this notion of caring, which comes out of love, can be the love that you feel to a beautiful crystal that comes out of the Swiss Alps. Because you might find the beauty and aesthetics in that, and that might be also a source of your sort of care and leadership in that area as well, to protect those beautiful crystals. Could be. So I want to open up that area for you, not to only, keep it within that realm. But what I said was that all this constituency is like kind of, interacting constantly, right? Therefore, in servant leadership, all of this has to be seen as a conversation. There was a nice word. You can't have conservation without conversation, right? So you first have to be able to have a conversation around things. And Angiana was quite helpful in me in crafting this text here and this understanding. So in here, what we find out is that what it is about in this dialogue between all this constituency in the literature is not necessarily of physical proximity. I don't have to live together with the panther to have a conversation, but it is more of a mental and emotional proximity. The emotional proximity being, I love that panther. I care for the panther. Okay? And then the mental one is one of ideas, of joint goals and objectives and so forth. So that needs to be built on a rational, mental objectives, worldview, and so forth, and on an emotional proximity of caring, love, sympathy, empathy, whatever you want to identify in that area as well. Okay. So now, when we look at all of these different constituencies, one that is also important is the volunteers, and Daphne has helped me in putting that together and brought up a very nice, interesting example of the National Kidney Foundation, which was showing this research that when there was servant leadership in the volunteers, the motivation and the loyalty to the organization increased. So whenever you had these kinds of servant leadership approaches, you were seeing that basically as compared to this kind of charismatic leadership or other forms of leadership, that servant leadership was able to provide an indication of these non-profit services in a much better way. Now, coming from these NGOs and how they deal with their volunteers, let's look at how some of the transnational NGOs look at themselves and whether they have adopted some of these strategies. How many of you know about the campaigning organization Avaz? Who has ever known about it? You don't know about Avaz? No? Never heard of it? Wow, amazing. How many people have heard about Change.org? A bit more. Wow, cool. Not from me, right? You heard it from before. Okay.
Not from you.
You heard, okay, no, then you don't come. Well, that's interesting because Avaz has also quite a high user base, both in the US and globally. And what they do is they follow an ethic of servant leadership in their approach. And basically what they do is they listen to their membership in setting their agenda in advance of doing something. Now this is a bit different, of course, from the Change.org model because they listen to their membership and then they run their campaigns. However, in Change.org, it is really the constituency itself who uses the Change.org service to start their own petitions and campaigns. So it is driven by the public and the individual out there rather than the organization. The organization, Change.org, only provides a service, hence the servant leadership model that Change.org has also adopted, as has Avaz, trying to do that. But what's interesting with the Avaz model is that the rationale, they didn't have much connection between their membership. So they weren't building, so to say, a community. And by not building a community, they were essentially focusing more on the user's effectiveness, the user making a change, rather than the user being engaged in the larger campaign itself and feeling useful there. Because what it wanted to do is quick mass mobilization of people to win those campaigns, essentially. However, there is an important article by Vasek which points out that activists which are engaged in these struggles in campaigning need strong ties with each other so that they can build these networks to create the change. If the activists come together in weak ties, if they don't form that community, which was so essential in servant leadership, then the effectiveness and the success rate of those are usually lower. So all of these arguments show us that servant leadership in the NGO context and in the transnational NGO context is something that would increase both the effectiveness but also the legitimacy in the eyes of all the constituency that is engaged in this process to start with. As a final indication from the literature, I want to talk about the role of top leadership in large American business, which is shifting away from the dominant decision maker to that of the manager of the information system. Leadership depends more on the pull of the overarching goals, building the competence and sustaining the autonomy of many decision makers. Now, Robert Greenleaf wrote that in 1977. Today, it is more valid than it has ever been. Because what we talk about right now, even in the Obama campaign or in managing big businesses, is always about big data, right? So why is big data so important? Because what big data does is allows you to understand the system parameters. If you can make sure to extract the data, which is neither too fine nor too broad, at the right level, it can give you information of how your system is performing. Now, imagine you're a servant leader. You brought in your leadership team. You sat together around the table and you decided, based on data, on your objectives and your key results that you want to achieve. You decided them. You put them there. You agreed on them all together. It's not you as the leader said, guys, this is what we're doing now. This is the numbers I want you to achieve. Go! You know, that would be kind of the charismatic leadership. What you say is, okay, we all want our organization to succeed. And you all want to put your creativity, your best into this, to make this happen. Here are parameters which we can work with. What do you think we can do with all of those? What can we do our best? What would be a challenge for us? Okay? And you decide on these key results together. Then, if you've got the right people, there's no management. There are some policies. There are some values, right? That the organization holds true, the values of the organization. Then there's the policies of the organization. Does everyone know about our values and policies? Yes, of course, right? We all know them. Then go around, get them. You know, there's no more management. So all you do is look at the numbers after that. And every team, every unit works together to achieve those. Then it becomes a truly collective endeavor in which you do not lead the kind of driven, charismatic, whatever leadership, because it's the internal drive. It's the self-actualization of the person, of the people who can make that happen. Okay, I've spoken quite a bit. Let's wrap this up and finish it. So these are the conclusions, basically. Basically, servant leadership is only viable model of leadership, given all of these, for transnational NGOs, given the critical challenges that we face today, right? We've talked about the critical area. We need to get that donut. And this is no easy feat. And getting to those, it becomes quite obvious that we can only get there by a collective mental commitment to those objectives of creating that just and sustainable society which doesn't harm the environment. And that can only really come from these kinds of values of leadership. Because if we don't change the values of our leadership, we reproduce this environment of crisis. Because the type of leadership, in a way, lies at the heart of our failure to be able to build the society that we want and to endanger the planet itself. So it's like Oz in the movie. You will know, of course, since you watched it. Oz basically does not need to seek greatness at the end. to be able to save that world. But what he needed to work is with people in goodness. And while doing that, that was the key of saving that world. Community and teamwork is essential for transnational NGOs to succeed. Oz could only win in the movie against the evil forces when everyone came together. When everyone in the organization, everyone in this world came together under the same cause. Now this is important. You have a cause under which you bring people together. And that can obviously not be through persuasion or coercion. The only way it can really happen is through this kind of conversation of emotional and mental togetherness. Through co-creation can that cause happen. And then everyone brings their own talents, their own expertise onto the table and works together to achieve that, which is exactly what happens in Oz. The last one, the last point, information is key for managing transnational NGOs under a servant leadership model so that the true creative and learning teamwork can happen. Like we said, you come and work with information rather than with, and you all agree on these criteria. For example, in the movie, what happens is Glinda gets captured. And Glinda is kind of the good fairy witch of this world. And she's kind of the natural leader, quote unquote, right? And what happens is Glinda gets caught and is out of the game. Glinda is out of the game, but it is irrelevant whether Glinda is there as a leader or not. Because they are together and they are working together for the cause and they're all putting their creativity together and they have the ability to work together as a team. And therefore, the outcome is the same. Maybe it isn't just as planned because that's where creativity comes, because plans always change, because circumstances change. But if you have your creativity, if you have your team, if you have your trust, then it is easily that you can overcome. So let's see if finally we can build that kind of servant leadership and turn around the evil side to the goodness side. Because if we don't turn evil to the good side, then essentially we cannot create that beautiful green donut for us. Because eventually, for that, everything, every destructive force that exists there will need to turn around and be together with us. So she is not our enemy. Today, she is us. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'll go like this, okay? You start and then we go like that.
Very interesting presentation. Obviously, I agree with your point. Servant leadership has incredible results. However, so one of your conclusions, the first conclusion says that basically servant leadership is the only viable form of leadership, and you provided the evidence you provided data that it does produce good results. However, have you considered other forms of leadership? And in other words, have you studied the counterfactual?
Yeah, that's what these research have looked at. They looked at other kinds of leaderships versus the servant leadership. So it's a comparative study between servant leadership and non-servant leadership.
And what kind of methods did you use?
I think all of these are, if you look at them, they are published empirical studies which have been peer-reviewed and so forth. But I am very skeptical of empirical reductionistic science, okay? Although I am a scientist myself, I have done many different studies. I have designed experiments and came up with significant results and so forth. And I believe in those results. But I also believe in what feels good. Ask yourself, would you like to work with a leader common sense in a way. Would you like yourself?
Right, well, that's how I started
Uh-huh.
my question, because I agree that intuitively we all agree with this statement. I was just wondering if there's really hardcore data that would prove it, and what makes this, I mean, there are different situations also that organizations face, and sometimes, like, have you studied different types of situations, or is it like a normality, so what are the...
I can tell you one thing, like I'm going to repeat myself a little bit. There is some indication, there is some empirical study. That critique that, or that question that you asked has been asked in the 80s and 90s. Therefore, they started this kind of research in looking whether, first defining what servant leadership is, which I don't think is so easy definable, but let's put up a framework for it. And then look at those variables which identify servant leadership, and then look at those, how they perform overall. What they have found is that there is an indication that it has a positive effect. Do you ask me, is it enough to prove without any doubt? From a scientist's perspective, maybe not, but from a practitioner's perspective who has done this work for many years, I am convinced.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation actually, that is mobilization of citizen activities and NGOs.
That was the previous one.
Actually, since for 2 days, I would like to drag myself from your hypothetical circle and put myself in reality. So, could you please give us some empirical evidence in certain place and days that we see this servant leadership?
Just go, yeah.
My second question is just, let me put all my questions in the front. You say that there is significant relationship between servant leadership and leader trusts. And the second is also significant relationship between servant leadership and employee motivation. As a statistician, I would like to see the correlation coefficient, at what degree the accuracy of the data, the analysis, which tools have been used. If you have this study, could you please...
I will send it to you. Just give me your email. I'll send you the papers, all of it.
As a statistician, I'm not skeptic like you. I'm on the opposite side. I'm working with statistics estimation for more than 20 years. I'm a econometrician now. I would like to measure everything quantitatively.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so on. The last question is, actually, I'm planning as part of my project in Maxwell School, that is Civic Integration and Leadership. I'm planning to establish NGO that is Center for Refugee and Migration Studies in my university.
Excellent.
Already I submitted my whole project and my work plan, but today I'm going to redesign it after your smart lecture. I don't want to be leader, I would like to be servant leader actually. I'm thanking you. This will take for me more days to redesign the model again.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
No. So it is, by the way, I came to today's lecture when I see Dr. Tosca. She told me, why you are not coming? Actually, I thought that the lecture is tomorrow, not today.
Ah, okay.
So she dragged me to your lecture.
Okay.
So thank you very much to you. And
thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. That was great. I'm glad that it's going to help, let's hope, and not sort of make you do the job again. I think, like our other colleague, I think you're right in those. And if you leave me your emails after, I actually have your email. Yeah, I have your email already. So I'll send you the articles and you can look at the statistics behind it and so forth. But I myself am not convinced that the empirical studies are sufficient. Let's put that on the table. But what is the level of sufficiency is also a question. When is it beyond doubt that it is the best model? And does something like you ask, a best model exist? Because the circumstances and situations change, like I was telling. But I believe from my own practice and from my own experience that the approach that I have described here, in the long run, if you try to adhere them wherever you are and situationally vary them where needed, it's the best overall strategy. And it also creates the best staff motivation, staff performance, really, because they show their self-actualization, they go into their office, they use their creativity, you bring them together around the thing, and then you don't boss them around. I mean, today's youth and today's society, they don't like bossing around. Let's, right? I mean, they're just too smart for that. They just think, oh, come on, get some humility. I'm a human, you're a human. What's the difference, right? So what is it that makes you, because you studied so much or you're like 20 years older than me, do you have the right to boss me around? You know, who are you to tell me? So my approach is, okay, let's learn together. Let's figure it out together. Let's, that's a lot more fun too. It's fun for both sides. I mean, it's also more fun for the leader who has to bring all of this together to be working together. It makes a lot of more things. Yes. Anjana.
First of all, thank you, Uygar, for your inspiring lecture and presentation. My question.
So it did work with all the preparations you guys did, huh? Do you think are you satisfied with it?
I think it's a good summary.
Huh?
Yeah, it's a good summary.
Okay, good.
But I have an important question. What do you see as the biggest obstacles or challenges, not only in servant leadership, but in other models of constructive leadership, especially in the context of civil society or NGOs? Did you encounter something in the literature or from your own personal experience? Where I come from in Serbia, I can speak from my own experience as an NGO practitioner in the past 10 years. We have a very young civil society that flourished after the whole communist regime, and especially after the October Revolution in 2000. And although we have, in many of our NGOs, we have what you would call certain leaders, they sometimes tend to be autocratic, which is a paradox. So within their organizations, they are behaving as certain leaders, but they find it very difficult to let it go. And there is the biggest problem in our NGO scene is the so-called founder syndrome. So leaders of our NGOs that are...
They won't let go.
Yes, they were dissidents during the communist regime. Then in the 90s, they established these big think tanks, organizations, and they are still there after 20, 30 years.
Right.
So what was your perception? What would you say is the biggest challenge?
Well, what you say is a great challenge, and I myself tried to put an example of that. For example, I founded Nature Society, BirdLife in Turkey. After I founded it and was in the first board, I was the chairman. And after the first term, having it brought to that point, I gave it over to a new generation of people to take it forward. So I did my part, bringing together, organizing, and so forth, and then I delivered it over. And then with Greenpeace Mediterranean, where I stayed for 5 years, where my team has been able to produce an incredible growth in both impact and in financial resources, where essentially I was in a position where I had hired every single one of the people in the office after 5 years, because a normal NGO, when I took over the Greenpeace Mediterranean, it had a turnover rate of 58%. And then over 5 years, I dropped it to 20% turnover rate in staff, but which essentially meant that by the end of 5 years, the whole staff had changed. So I had hired every single one of them. And then I was there with them, full success. Everyone trusts you. That is the most dangerous zone you enter right after that. And that is you develop institutional blindness, you become too assured of yourself and your success and your power, and then it starts going down. And then happens what you say, the founder syndrome. So therefore, I came in even from the start knowing that 5 years is my max. 5 years I'm taking my hat and going, you know. I declared it from the very start, and then after 5 years I took my hat and I went. So I think that is also part of being a proper leader, is to follow these kinds of very typical governance rules. So somebody should tell those people who are, you know, sticking to their babies and not letting the baby grow and, you know, build his or her own life. That is something that is inappropriate management. I mean, the founder syndrome or the mother that wouldn't let go of the baby is the same kind of mentality. So you need to have things grow and take their own road. And if you don't let them fail and rebound and so forth, the baby will never walk. So I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah, I was just curious. If you had
That is a,
faith in that.
yeah. I mean, we had them in the past, but I think we're developing a new kind of leadership. That needs to happen. I mean, leaders also need to build an epistemic community in helping each other to be different as well, and to not hang and help each other, coach each other, mentor each other, have a, like it says in the research, you can cascade the servant leadership across, lateral and vertical. You can cascade it. So what needs to happen is we need to first adopt these practices and then cascade them so that they become they become norm. And once they become norm, then this change can start happening. Because for that change to happen, this kind of approach needs to be there. From a purely environmental and social sustainability perspective, really.
So thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. I also agree certainly with the servant leadership style. But I have a couple questions. My first question is, theoretically, this makes a lot of sense, and I've seen it work practically as well.
Mm-hmm.
However, implementing this can also have a number of challenges. For example,
Very good.
it's so hard to find that team where everyone is willing to work together, right? So that's one issue. Another issue is people will take advantage of servant leaders, especially in the mid-level. So if you are trying to be a servant leader and someone sees that you will actually do a lot of the work, or you're trying to collaborate, of that mentality, I think people can try to take advantage of you.
Okay.
Have you come across any of that in your research?
I'll give you, I'm going to give you practical. There's no research on this. This is practical thing. First of all, you identified two things well. People who take advantage, finding the people. Then if you don't find the people or some people taking advantage, there's another one. There's time. Because this type of leadership needs a lot of conversation, dialogue, process, building, forming together. Both at the top level, I said, you come across the table, you say, and then you say run, right? But you say run, but then you need a servant leader in that team that runs it also to keep that creativity. And then if that team has another sub-team, that also has to have that. So that cascading thing that we were talking about. Now at every level, you have to decide and come together and build that, co-create that. And that is not an easy thing. So that takes time. And sometimes you don't have that time. There are so many pressures and everything that running these processes becomes a challenge. I should put these into the paper, by the way. Thank you. Great. So these 3 points. What was it? Team, advantage takers, and time. Okay. As challenges to it. Now, coming to the right team, that needs an experience of looking at team chemistries. I can't give you a formula for that because building team chemistry is an art form. It's like cooking. Okay? So there's a cook which creates fantastic food, and then there's a cook with the same ingredients, can't necessarily produce them, or there's one ingredient that's missing, and that's why it's not turning out that way. And that's how building these teams is a little bit like. So one needs experience and coaching and talking and thinking, and but team building in a servant leadership mode is a lot easier, because then you can work with people to align everything a little bit better than without the servant leadership. Because when you don't have the servant leadership, teams usually break, because you try to force things on the team rather than build the team its own dynamic and its own functioning through their own negotiation and process of talking and conversing with each other. Advantage takers. As a servant leader, when somebody takes advantage, you express it. You say it. Happens again, you say it again. Happens again, you fire them. That's as simple as that. Any community, if you don't follow the basic human qualities of respect, honesty, working together, all of those, you don't work with them. It's as simple as that. That's a basic management principle. And if you take management roles in the future, one of your most important tasks will be to tell people you can't work together with them. Because if you don't do that, it is an injustice to everyone else in your team. And as a leader, that is one thing that you have to not let happen, injustice to other people. That's a very painful thing, but it is what one needs to do. Yeah. Is there anyone else you asked?
I just have one more question.
Yeah.
Would you allow him one more? He's a young man, so let's get him. Okay.
Thank you. So my second question has to do with the constituents.
Mhm.
And I realize that you have an environmental focus,
Mhm.
but I think something that's very important is including beneficiaries as constituents.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
certainly if they don't have input, in the idea of transnational NGOs or humanitarian or development, if beneficiaries aren't included, then it's really worthless.
Right. Let me look at the thing. I think here, oops, why isn't it going there? Okay, so when we said here, board, staff, volunteers, members, donors, supporters, with supporters, actually I also mean beneficiaries or users at the same time, in the case of Change.org, for example. Because you don't have supporters, but you have users. You don't have donors, but you have clients, for example, in that sense. So here, your beneficiaries actually could also be equivalent with donors in a way. Because they are the ones which you do servicing, which you give service. You can think of this, if this is an NGO, it services donors because the donors give them money to do a certain task. So they do deliver it for the donors, if you think of it in those terms. Of course, a lot of NGOs will try to separate between dedicated funds, undedicated funds, and so forth, and then wouldn't treat donors as their employer, so to say, because it's really their constituency. But whenever you start taking big money from a big foundation, you essentially become their employee. So because you have a contractual agreement and so forth, right? However, for example, organizations like Greenpeace, their donors will be micro donors. So they will give like 100,000 people will give 10 euros per person per month, and then they do not, there's no obligation towards this one person, but there is a, then you have to have the legitimacy of doing the right things in their eyes of the donors. So does that answer some of your question?
So I'm referring more to like people who are receiving it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the case of like Change.org, the people.
It's the users who
Right,
receive
it's
the service.
But say a different, say like, I don't know, say the World Food Program, people who are receiving the food.
Okay.
If, for example, I just think that's a really important point to include their satisfaction or their approval as stakeholders in the entire operation.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, let me make that more clearer then. I think that's good feedback. I will add, beneficiaries maybe as a seventh or as within supporters or within donors into that framework, but name it so that it becomes more. That's great. So that's good to also address the, so to say, the development transnational NGOs that broadens the thing. Yeah, great. Thank you. Any other questions from that? Yes.
Do you think there is a relation between politicians and servant leaders?
Uh-huh.
In my opinion, I don't think, because politicians they are leaders, they are not servants.
They should be.
They should be.
They should be. Well, I mean,
How we
in a representative democracy, we elect them there to represent us. So they're our servants, our representatives there. That's how it should be. Unfortunately, that is not happening is, again, our failure in governance. I mean, I think we need to create a different framing, a different expectation, so that they become our servants. I think in the US, for state representatives, the members of Congress, they have quite a bit of accountability with their voter base. I see that the voter base will shift their behavior and their voting patterns quite effectively here, for example, because the voters will tell them, hey, you're responsible to me and to your district, and we want you to act like this, so you better represent us, or we won't give you the vote next time. So there is this kind of pressure in here. But if it comes to Turkey, for example, I can tell you there's zero. They feel not responsible to any of their voter base. They only feel responsible to the leader of the party, because the whole in-party structure is so undemocratic. It doesn't depend whether they get elected or not on the voter base, or who they are. It depends on where they are listed in the list by the internal party structure. So their only allegiance is to the leader of the party, which basically rules the whole thing. I understand it's similar in your case.
Same system, yeah.
Yeah. So it's very, very difficult to. Yeah, we need to change that. But hey, we need a new transnational NGO for that. Go for it. Any? Yes, June?
I got two questions about how to put this servant leadership into practice.
Uh-huh.
First one is, as we know, the organization will have its life cycle from startup to evolve and go to scale. So do you think on which stage the servant leadership could be most effective in organization management, or you think in every stage it will be effective? And second one is how to shift your original leadership to the servant leadership as a leader in organization.
Well, what happens is when you have a startup, you have a very small team. And when you have a very small team, you also have a much more collegial, much more close relationship where you can have a lot of interaction. When you start growing in size and you become bigger and bigger, what happens is you start adding management layers. So I think that if you've gotten a good start with servant leadership at the startup level, every time you add a new management layer, if you're able to shift the culture, the practices, and the approach to that level, and then go into the next level, sort of like a layered cake, and by every layer that you're putting in, if you can build that principles of servant leadership, I think then you will have this overarching structure, culture, and so forth in your organization, and it will work better. There is some research which shows that if you are more than 150, that you should become more and more independent. And you should have, not units that are not independent for more than 150. Here, again, servant leadership provides a perfect framework, because servant leadership is about enabling, empowering, letting loose, letting them come together on certain specific issues. So you can have this kind of segmentation of smaller pieces of 150 and so forth, given your business model, and then give them the kind of autonomy that would bring, that would come by with this kind of servant leadership approach. How do I apply it in my regional responsibility and being on the leadership at Change.org? I think everyone has that kind of notion in the team at Change.org. Servant leadership is definitely something that people talk about. They say we want to be servant leaders. So there is a commitment to it. And there's also a lot of collegial interaction, conversations. And through those conversations, we are able to help each other out and bring things together. And since we have separated teams, for example, me being responsible of Eastern Europe and West Asia, I have teams that are not in my immediate proximity, remember? So what I try to do is then create that mental and emotional connection with them and manage them on agreed objectives and not really do micromanagement like a lot of structured organizations will do. They will dictate every single little bit and piece that you need to do. Do not say anything, just look at the results, let them organize their day and so forth. But if they're getting the results, they work the way they want. What is it my business? If that person is able to do all of the agreed goals with their own creativity and their own flexibility, they do it. I mean, I'm not going to tell them to, change this sentence or do that or and so forth. That's my overall approach.
Tell me a little bit about the funding. Are you build your model on donors only? Because every activity needs time and fund. For example, if I would like to do rallies, for example, I have to spend a lot of money for that. So is your model depending on only the donors or?
I mean, every NGO every NGO has their own funding model.
Yeah.
For example, Change.org creates its resources through allowing matchmaking between civil activists and larger environmental NGOs. So not environmental, all NGOs, sorry. Falling back on my identity. So, for example, there's Amnesty. And Amnesty is running an advocacy campaign or is running a fundraising campaign. Then it can talk about its campaign for people who sign human rights petitions. And if the person wants to get more information or its address shared with Amnesty, they will click a button and then their information will go to Amnesty and Change.org will get a commission from this matchmaking. That's how Change.org creates its resources to be able to deliver the services. Now with Greenpeace, Greenpeace does canvassing or through lead generation like it does with Change.org. It finds people and asks them, would you want to donate us money? So it gets little chunks of money from many different people, undedicated money, which then it can run its campaigns. Amnesty will be very picky, mostly will be like that, will be very picky and might take a bit of money from a few larger foundations. Now, for example, Oxfam also, I think as far as I know, takes money from the government, from corporations as well, does face-to-face, so does get individual donations, but also has a small-scale commercial operation of selling fair trade goods and foods and so forth as well. So there's every NGO will have its own appropriate funding model which matches its mission. That's how it works.